murder occurred not far from a military base where a farmer was known to allow kids on his property. But when a classmate was last seen with the victim prior to her disappearance, the multiple possible serial killers in the area at the time were overlooked. A 14-year-old was sentenced to death for a crime he and many others claimed he couldn't have committed. Evidence and witness statements were thrown out or picked apart to find only the information that would prove this 14-year-old guilty. And they almost got away with it too. But why were they so adamant to charge this boy with the murder? Who or what were they covering up? You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke Makenna, but today's case is going to be about the 14-year-old who was convicted for his classmate's murder. It is yet another installment in ODDtober. If you don't know, I post the strangest cases I can find, a whole bunch throughout October, and call it ODDtober. And I also have merch out right now. There will be a link to it down below. It's the Speak Up Your Voice is Powerful Enough merch. And I also want to thank our sponsor, Fetch, for allowing me to continue creating these videos. Now, Fetch is an app where you can earn free rewards on literally anything you buy. It's as easy as scanning a receipt, earning points, and then gaining enough points to get gift cards to places like Amazon, Visa, Starbucks, Walmart, and more. And you can even be redeemed for online shopping. All of this and Fetch is completely free to download and to use. So if you'd like to feel a little bit better about your purchases and even make a little bit of money back, then all you have to do is download Fetch for free with the link in my description. And also, Fetch is giving you guys the deal. If you use code Brooke Mckenna, you will get 5,000 points when you scan your first receipt. So make sure to download it down below. And now let's get back to the story. So it was 1959 in Canada, and Lynn Harper lived in Clinton, Ontario. Now, Lynn was this 12-year-old girl whose real name was actually Cheryl Lynn Harper. However, she preferred to go by Lynn. She had actually been born August 31st of 1946 in New Brunswick. However, due to her father's job, she was all over the country during her short life. You see, Lynn was actually the daughter of a flying officer named Leslie Harper in the Royal Canadian Air Force. She also had a mother named Shirley who was a stay-at-home mother, and they all lived on a military base at Station Clinton in Clinton, Ontario. They had been there for the last 2 years, and she actually wasn't the only child. She had an older brother named Barry and a younger brother named Jeffrey as well, and they all lived in the permanent married quarters. Now, Lynn was said to be this powerful force even in her young age. She was a talker, she was bossy, she was a live wire, energetic, and she loved being competitive in sports and playing baseball, as well as raising her hand and answering all the questions that she knew in class. She was not afraid to speak up. She stood up for herself, and she didn't always listen to adults or her parents. She would sometimes get in arguments with them, but that is pretty normal for a regular preteen. She was the typical moody sort of teenager. She was a very strong girl, but she also had her insecurities, and she actually had a scar above her lip that she had from her childhood, and she really was insecure about this, and people would point it out a lot since it was on her face. And so she wasn't the most popular girl. She didn't have the most confidence or the most friends, but overall her biggest priorities as a 12-year-old was going to school when she was in 7th grade, going to her extracurricular activities, and making friends, or hanging out with her on-again, off-again boyfriend named George Archibald. That's all she should have had to have focused on as a young child, not fighting for her life. You see, on June 9th, just 2 months before she would become an official teenager at 13 years old, she would vanish. She was at a baseball game after school that day, and then her teacher actually drove her home. And so she got home, she had dinner, and around 6:15, she began asking her parents if she could go to the swimming pool. And the only problem was a parent actually had to go so you could get a pass to go in if you were a minor. She was getting upset because her parents were telling her no, that they couldn't go with her. And so she decided around 6:15 to go ahead and leave, not go to the swimming pool, but to leave the house for a while. And she was actually wearing brown loafers, blue shorts, and a white shirt, as well as carrying around a plexiglass locket that had the Royal Canadian Air Force symbol on it. Now, her father reported her missing to Station Clinton around 11 p.m. that evening, and due to this being a military base, it was taken a little bit more seriously than a typical missing persons report, because during this time, the kids didn't have phones to contact their parents. They would often go out and play outside or at other people's homes, and no one really knew where their kids were. It's just how it was during this time. And so normally police were saying, let's wait a little bit and see if they just come home on their own. And this is sort of what happened, because the Ontario Provincial Police took 2 days before they began searching, and at that point they did have 250 people, including military or the soldiers living on base, who were out searching. Now, it was odd for it to be such a big search, such a big deal, because like I said, they really didn't take missing persons reports of children seriously. And so it was really big news for Lynn to have disappeared. That evening, they would find her. Not a long period compared to most searches, however, they would still be too late. You see, on June 11th, the search party entered a 150-acre farm lot known as Lawson's Bush and Lawson's Farm. Sometimes the bush was just called the bush, not Lawson's Bush, but it was in the same neighborhood as that military base station in Clinton. This is where Lynn would be found, partially nude, covered in scratches and bruises. The autopsy revealed that she had been strangled to death with her own shirt that was around her neck when she was found. She had also been sexually assaulted. Now, due to the defense wounds, it did appear as though she had fought back, and the searcher who found her body claimed that he had found the clothes that weren't on her body, such as, her socks and her shoes, all folded neatly next to her, and her necklace she had been wearing, that locket I told you about, it was hanging from a branch of a tree nearby.
First thing I saw is her clothes, and her clothes were laying there rather neatly, I thought. And I thought, why would a little girl be out here without any clothes on? And then I looked at her and I thought, oh my heavens, no. I knew then that she was dead.
Now, there were footprints around this area, there were bike tracks, car tracks, but this was not an uncommon place for people, especially kids, to be, and we will get into why in just a moment. But from Lynn's stomach contents, the ME determined that she had died anywhere from 7:15 to 7:45 p.m. the night that she had vanished. Now, investigators began to believe and tell others that the killer would have had scratches all over him or some sort of injury due to the fight that it took to kill Lynn. Now, the dumping grounds of Lynn's body was a farm that was owned by a man named Bob Lawson. He was 23 years old. He owned the farm, he lived there, and it had basically been passed down from generations, which is how he acquired it so young. And so Bob told police that there were always kids playing there, that he didn't mind. He had so much land that the kids would come and play, and they normally didn't cause any harm. And they were either there or at the school, and he figured that that was better than them getting into some sort of trouble. And he would even ask them to help out with the chores sometimes, and they were more than willing to. It was something that he actually loved, to get to have them help him. Now, investigators actually took Bob Lawson to the crime scene before Lynn was taken in and showed him the body, and that is when he would confirm that Lynn was one of the children who would often play on his land and help out with the chores. Now, this is where Bob Lawson actually became a very important part of the investigation, or he should have been. You see, he said that the night of her murder, he had seen a very strange car parked at his fence line that night, and he believed that it was a convertible, possibly a 1953 Ford. He claimed that he had been with a neighbor when they had seen this car with a man driving and a woman who looked smaller, or at least shorter, sitting next to him in the passenger seat. They couldn't identify either of them as being anybody that they actually knew, but Bob believed that this could be a huge lead in helping to find the killer. However, he was then told that the killer had already been found. You see, another tip had come in previously before Lynn's body was even found when the search was occurring, and this witness claimed to have seen Lynn Harper the evening before she vanished and was murdered, and she was not alone. Now, this witness had said that they had seen two children riding a bike along the county road, which was, right from the school to the military base to Lawson's Bush and then to Highway 8. And so they were riding along that road, appearing to be headed towards Highway 8. This was a young girl and a young boy, and the boy was actually the one riding the bike, and the girl was just kind of leaning on the handlebar to have a ride. Now, this witness said that not long after seeing them go past, the boy came back, but the girl was not with him. They said that he headed back to the military base, and when the descriptions of these young kids were given, it was believed that the girl was Lynn Harper, and the boy was a 14-year-old boy named Stephen Truscott. Now, Stephen Truscott was born January 18th of 1945 in British Columbia to parents Dan and Doris. Now, he had 3 siblings, Ken, Bill, and Barbara, and he also lived on the military base because his father Dan was an officer. Now, Stephen and his siblings went to the same school as Lynn, and even though the two were 2 years apart, the schoolroom that they were actually in at the time had both of them in it. They had multiple different grades, and so Stephen and Lynn were actually in the same class. Since they, went to the same school, lived in the same place, they were said to be friends. In fact, Lynn was said to have a little bit of a crush on the older Stephen. Stephen was often described as a tall, good-looking, soft-spoken, well-liked, athletic, and popular boy, and was always playing down in the river that was on that same road near the bush a little bit farther out before you got to the highway with his friends. His classmates claimed that they all felt safe around him all the time. He was a very good friend. However, as we know, a killer can be under disguise most of his life. Now, Stephen was questioned at this point, and he immediately told police that around 7 p.m. he was at the school, kind of just playing around with his friends. He then grabbed his bike and was getting ready to go to the river where some of his other friends were. And that is when Lynn approached him, asked him what he was doing, and asked if he could give her a ride to that highway. She had planned on going to hitchhike or to walk the rest of the way because she wanted to go and see some ponies. She told him on the way there because he agreed. It was on his way. It was just a little farther out, so he didn't mind. So he agreed to take her, and he said on the way she was saying she had gotten into an argument with her parents that evening, and that basically she needed to get out of the house. She wanted to see ponies and knew where they were, but she needed a ride to get there. So he rode from the school past the bush, over the bridge where the river was, and then to that highway where he dropped her off around 7:30 p.m. Now, Stephen said he was riding off when he looked back and he saw Lynn getting into this car. It was a gray 59 Chevy car with what he described as large fin-like wings and lights that looked like cat eyes. There was also something orange on the back, but he couldn't tell whether it was a bumper sticker or a license plate. Stephen then said he was back by 8 p.m. to babysit because he had to babysit his siblings. But Bob Lawson was spoken to, the man that had the property where Lynn was found, and said that Stephen was actually a good friend of his, that he would often go there to help out with chores and to just, do things around the farm with Bob. They were kind of actually friends. He knew the area well. And when the time of death came out to be around the same time that Stephen appeared to be with Lynn, that is when they began to point the finger at Stephen. And the day after Lynn was found, Stephen Truscott was pulled out of class and arrested for her murder. Now, Inspector Harold Graham was in charge of this case, and he believed that Stephen was the killer. He was certain of it. However, many were appalled that this 14-year-old boy was involved in any way. Either they believed that a kid can't be a killer, or they were realizing that it was possible. Now, for the military base that was nearby, all of this was taboo, but they were just basically relieved that it didn't have anything to do with them once Stephen was arrested. The problem was there was no investigation once Stephen was actually in custody, and there wasn't really anything prior to arresting Stephen. And many components of the timeline here were not addressed, especially the fact that the witness who had seen Stephen and Lynn riding and then Stephen coming back said that Stephen was not frantic. He was not out of breath. He was not sweating, did not appear to have any injuries. And this was strange for someone who had quickly rode the bike, killed her, sexually assaulted her, and came back in a very short amount of time. This witness even claimed that Stephen looked calm, and while killers can appear to be calm, Lynn's murder was said to have exerted a bit of strength, especially because it was believed that she fought back, and Stephen at this point was said to have no scratches or bruises on his body at all. Now this is where it gets extremely crazy, because this did not stop Stephen from being tried as an adult only 3 months later without any further investigation. Stephen's father was then transferred to another military base, and his family had to come back to support him because they believed that he was innocent and did not do this. During questioning, when Stephen was first brought in after he was arrested, Stephen was said to have no lawyer present, no parents present. He was questioned for hours on end, and he said that he was watching the boys who were swimming in the river when Lynn got into the car, which is why he kind of looked back and saw her get in. Now, this person didn't drag her in. He said that she actually stepped in and sat down. No matter how much they pushed him, he refused to confess. And so on September 30th of 1959, after 15 days of witnesses and lawyers telling just how Stephen did or didn't murder Lynn, he was found guilty. Now, while in his jail cell, he was actually transferred to a cell without a window because his brother was climbing trees to be able to see his brother. Now, during the trial, investigators claimed that Stephen was a liar, that there was no way from where he was at the bridge that he could look back and see the type of car that Lynn had gotten into with such grave detail. They said they had done an experiment and that they could not identify a car at all from that distance. Now, investigators did go back and speak to a lot of the children at Lynn and Stephen's school, and so most of their witnesses would be children. Now, they had gotten to one girl, a little girl named Jocelyn, and she said that a day before the murder, Stephen had come up to her and asked her on a date the next day in Lawson's bush, the bush that Stephen and Lynn would ride past. Now, Jocelyn testified that the evening of the murder was when they were supposed to have their date, and Stephen had driven past her house and reminded her, we have the date, or make sure you're going to be there. And so she said later on she rode down to the bush to try to get to Stephen and was looking for him, and then even drove to Lawson's farm to ask him if he had seen Stephen. Investigators took this as Stephen wanted to take a girl to the bush, which is where most people had sexual activity, and that he wanted to have sex with someone. And so when he took Lynn there and she refused, that is when he killed her. Now, a friend of Stephen's named Butch George testified that Stephen and Lynn were in the bush that evening, and he had told multiple of his friends before, it was even announced that Lynn was missing or anything, that they were together in that bush. And Philip Burns then testified. He was only 10 years old, and he was walking that same route of that road the same time that Stephen and Lynn would have been. He said he did not see them at all, and investigators said this was because they were already in the bush at that time. Now, two boys on the bridge who were friends of Stephen claimed that they had seen Lynn and Stephen ride past the bridge and going down to the highway, and Lynn was still very much alive, meaning Stephen couldn't have killed her in the bush. And Lynn very much was happy, smiled at them even. However, investigators then claimed that these boys, where they were standing, were too far away to actually see anything. And then, shockingly enough, doctors testified that Stephen actually had 2 large lesions on his private area, the worst they had ever seen, and they believed this was because of the sexual assault. So the consensus was Stephen Truscott lured Lynn, knocked her unconscious, carried her to the bush, sexually assaulted her, strangled her, and then went on his merry way. He was sentenced to death by hanging. This meant he was the youngest person in Canadian history to be given the death penalty, and a reporter named Pierre Burton, who was really the only one to speak out about maybe we're wrong here in sentencing a 14-year-old to death, maybe he's not the killer, he wrote a poem saying, "The cell is lonely, the cell is cold. October is young, but the boy is old. Too old to cringe and too old to cry. Though young, but never too young to die. At last we have something to boast about, with a national law in the name of the Queen, to hang a child who is just 14. Now this execution was pushed until 1960, and the 14-year-old boy was set to be hanged in the new year. But then his sentence was surprisingly commuted to a life sentence due to some people, causing an uproar and an outcry for this boy who is going to be executed in front of them. And this was huge and was going to be something that everybody was forever grateful for, because this boy would be later found to have been wrongfully convicted. And at least then he got the chance to make it out alive. But life was still not easy for this child, because he was in a prison known to be a gladiator school for its violence. He was with the most hardened criminals for the most horrific crimes, like the horrific crime he had been found guilty of. Now, at this point, psychiatrists in the prison were giving Stephen LSD to try to coerce him into confessing, because there was a lot of people who were starting to speak out saying that they did not believe that Stephen did this. He had never confessed. And so these psychiatrists were trying to force a confession. And even then, they could not get that. They didn't even get a waiver in his story.
And this is what the psychiatrists all were hinting at. Boy, you don't remember. So I said, hey, I know I'm not guilty. Whatever tests you want to do, I'll go along with them. And nothing came up to indicate that there was any guilt.
Now, like I said, the public was asking more questions, and more people were coming out with books, were speaking to the public about Stephen, and this really changed the entire justice system in Canada. And finally, the Supreme Court heard this case, and Stephen testified. Now, this testimony was said to be the most confusing and hard to follow, unlike his prior statements. However, Stephen had never testified before, and he would later say that he didn't have time to prepare, and after so long of so many people not believing him, he basically just thought it was useless, and he was very nervous. Now, 10 years later, Stephen was released on parole in 1969. And with nowhere to go, and some of the community still believing that he was a killer, he had really nowhere to turn to. And so his parole officer actually told Stephen that he could stay with him and his family, and that's how much he believed that Stephen was innocent.
Did you ever have any cause to regret that?
Not 1 minute. Personally, I have a great deal of trouble believing that he was guilty, because he's a very gentle person, and I don't see that type of emotion in him that would lead him to commit that type of an offense.
Now, life outside of prison was hard for a now adult Stephen, who had grown up inside of a cell. At this point, and for a while, he became a recluse. He did not talk to the media. He did not want to talk to anybody. However, in 2000, he decided to do an interview with the Fifth Estate. He told them he had changed his name, he had since gotten married, had children, had this whole regular family, a regular life. He had not gotten in trouble with the law ever again. He had even told his children what he had been through, and his daughter had actually learned about it in school, thankfully, after her dad had told her, and she went up to the teacher and she said, "Can we stop talking about this? This is my dad we're talking about." Stephen said that back then, when he was first arrested, he trusted the police. So when they told him to get into the car, he did so. He was in question for hours without a lawyer or his parents, and he began to get confused. He said he still did not confess, though, but he only told a doctor that he believed he could have sexually assaulted Lynn, but he didn't remember anything. It wasn't long after that he was just charged with the murder altogether, and the things that were told in the trial were said to be only half-truths, because Jocelyn, the little girl who said that Stephen had asked her on a date that exact night of the murder, her statement to police at first and then to the jury had huge differences. You see, she told the jury that she was looking for Stephen that night, but when she first told police, she said she was actually out looking for Lynn. It was also revealed that she had gone to Bob Lawson on that farm during the time of the trial when she was about to testify and asked him to lie about when she was there that night, because she had told the police and the jury about an hour off of when she was really at the farm. He refused and then consequently told people. Now, that friend of Stephen's named Butch, who had gone to tell many of his friends that Stephen and Lynn were in the bush that evening, he was never questioned about what exactly he saw. He even said that he and Jocelyn had met up while looking for Stephen and Lynn, and when Butch was asked, "Do you know where they are?" he said no. With every friend that he spoke to, he kept changing his story about what he had seen, what he had heard. No one actually knew what he had seen at all. And Philip Burns, the 10-year-old who was walking down that road, who said he did not see them at all, he was found to have not remembered that he had seen most people. A lot of people came forward and said, "I saw Philip, and he doesn't remember me," and he didn't. And both of those witnesses appeared not to be as credible, or all three really, as they appeared to be at the trial. Now, the witnesses at the bridge, the river, who said they had seen Lynn and Stephen riding by, that Lynn had smiled at them, they were called liars. They were just covering up for Stephen. Well, later on, it was discovered that a test had been done by police to see if it was possible to see where they were and where the bridge was, and it was deemed possible. But they lied about this in court. This meant that if these kids really had seen Stephen and Lynn, the murder could not have occurred in that bush prior, because Lynn was still alive. And these witnesses today say that they don't understand why Stephen was ever a suspect. He was always completely innocent. Now, the evidence that can be found today is very slim, and the autopsy is not one of those pieces that we have now. The time of death was determined to be very suspicious because it was exactly when Stephen would have been with her. And many believed that the medical examiner, Dr. John Penniston, had determined that exact time to be able to point the finger at Stephen. Later on, the ME confessed that he could have been off by 12 hours for her time of death. And then other MEs came forward and said the way that that ME tested the stomach contents as a reliable way to determine time of death was not something that was reliable at all.
Well, I'm not impressed at all. I think the bottom line is that there really was no valid method used to determine time of death. Under the best of circumstances, determination of time of death on a dead body may be very difficult, if not impossible.
The definition by time in this case is wrong.
And unfortunately, most of the DNA evidence that was found on Lynn and around Lynn was destroyed before it could even be tested. Now, the injuries spoken of about Stephen's private area, well, 2 doctors had said, yeah, there are those large lesions. He must have sexually assaulted somebody. Well, the 3rd doctor, who was actually the doctor in jail with Stephen, not with him, but working in the jail, he said that there were no injuries there ever. And Stephen said that they literally exaggerated everything. Now, there was also insect evidence that was gathered around Lynn's body and photographed, which could have helped in determining, when she was dumped, when she was murdered, but none of this was used in trial, and this will come up later on. But in 1997, another possible suspect was brought to the forefront. You see, retired Sergeant Barry Roll, he believes that he came in contact with a serial killer around that area and has been investigating him for the past 30 years. In his book, The Viable Suspect, Barry decided to give this possible killer the alias of Larry Talbot. This was said to be for the man's family's name to not be tarnished until he was officially suspect, because he, although he is a possible suspect in many cases, is not someone who has been named in the media at all, allegedly. Now, Barry claims that Larry has a very long criminal record and was a traveling salesman during this time. Now, we're going to call Barry the retired officer and then Larry as this possible serial killer so we don't get it confused, okay? Larry was said to be a person of interest in a case of Jacqueline English in 1969, 10 years after Lynn. She was only 15 years old when she vanished on a walk, and 5 days later she was actually found floating in a creek nude near Tilsonburg, which was an hour and 30 minutes away from Clinton. But the retired officer began investigating Larry for Lynn's murder as well as other murders after this retired officer actually had a run-in with him. You see, Larry attempted to rob this retired officer and his wife in 1971, and he actually assaulted his wife. And then the retired officer tried to run after him, but it was shot with a pellet gun, thankfully not a real gun. And then he kind of tackled Larry to the ground and arrested him. However, he got out on probation for this. Now, the retired officer was, of course, upset that he only got probation, but also believed that this man was much more evil than anybody even knew. And so he was following cases that would later occur in the area and found that 5 more bodies would be discovered within 2 hours of one another all around Larry's house or within driving distance of his home, including 19-year-old Linda White and Pauline Ivy Dudley, who was only 17 years old. Now, both of these girls were found in 1973. Pauline in a field after vanishing, walking home to her boyfriend's house. But Linda had actually vanished 5 years prior, so only her skeletal remains were actually found, and she actually had one arm missing. She was located in the woods, and investigators wondered if her killing was some sort of satanic ritual. Then, 9 years later, in 1982, Christina Price and 25-year-old Delia Adriano were killed. Now, Christina had vanished while walking to her employer's home, a home where she was nannying, and was found in the river nude a day later. Now, Delia had actually been in her parents' home alone when witnesses heard her screaming and then saw her being dragged out to a car by a man, and 2 months later she was found nude in a wooded area. Then, another 10 years later, in 1992, 19-year-old Valerie Stevens, who was pregnant at the time, was found buried. Now, with these victims, Pauline was allegedly found only 15 minutes from Larry's home, Christine 7 minutes, Delia 26 minutes, and Valerie 41 minutes. Now, the murders not found near Larry's home were Jacqueline, Linda, and Lynn, and they were believed to be where Larry would often travel for work. Most of these girls were either hitchhiking or walking, and there was also that strange gap of around 10 years every few murders. Now, in Pauline's murder, Larry's car was actually seen near where her body was found, and investigators decided to search it, and blood was allegedly found on the headrest, hair on the floor, and items in the trunk, but he was never charged with her murder or any of these murders. All of these murders remain unsolved. They have full-on investigations and suspect lists themselves, but retired officer Barry Roll believes that they all could be connected. So if Larry Talbot was this serial killer in the area, could he have killed Lynn as well? The retired officer Barry said that he believes that Lynn was killed in that exact area and left in that area because Larry knew that there was that military base and thought, there's a whole bunch of suspects there, no one will ever look at me. Now, Larry, whatever his real name is, was said to drive a gray 1957 Chevy Bel Air, which is a lot like what Stephen had told investigators he had seen. He was also known to be in Clinton, in that area, especially at Station Clinton, because he would often go there or near there for work, and he allegedly had a rape kit in his car. So was Stephen really convicted of one of these serial killers' murders? Was it Larry Talbot or another person, another serial killer? Or was it 7 different killers entirely, all who have yet to be caught? Now, by 2001, Stephen's case was appealed by the Association in Defense of the Wrongfully Convicted, and that same year, Inspector Harold Graham, who put him in prison, passed away. Now, in 2006, Lynn's body was actually exhumed to see if they could find any DNA evidence still on her body, since the other evidence had not been preserved and it had been destroyed. However, nothing was found on her body either. Now, by 2007, due to that insect evidence never spoken of at the trial, Stephen was acquitted of his charges. It was determined that the time of death originally determined for Lynn was incorrect. However, the courts did refuse to declare Stephen innocent, meaning he is still a possible suspect in this case. The Attorney General did apologize to him, though, and awarded him $6.5 million in compensation. However, Lynn's family don't really agree with this and don't believe that he was innocent, and never did. Now, this man named Larry Talbot, who is believed to be a serial killer, did pass away in 2008 without ever confessing or being charged with any murder. Now, that retired officer who has named Larry was said to go to Larry's home about 2 months before he passed away because Larry had called him, upset at him because this retired officer had started talking to a newspaper about him, not giving his name, but basically saying that this traveling salesman could be involved. And so he just wanted to complain about that to the retired officer. But as much as I hoped that this would have led to a deathbed confession, that's not what occurred, or at least it's not what is publicly known yet. But that is not the only suspect that was thought of for this case. Now, this was mainly just due to the public and then the investigators and reporters later on in the case, because really there were 0 other suspects when Lynn was first murdered, because it was just Stephen. So these came out much later. But years after Lynn's murder, the Air Force Base Station Clinton did finally close down. And this is when a file was found. However, nobody would see that file until about 40 years later, when the Fifth Estate would be able to locate it around 2010. Now, this file was a psychiatric evaluation file and just kind of a whole bunch of findings about one man in the military who was a very heavy drinker and who appeared to be a sexual predator with several sexual offenses on his record dating back for decades. His name was Sergeant Alexander Kalachuk. That's right, a sergeant. He was born on November 3rd of 1923, and he didn't live on that exact base, but he did work for them. He lived about 20 minutes away with his family, and he would often make trips to the Clinton base and worked with Lynn's father. Now, this file claimed that 3 weeks prior to Lynn's murder, Alexander had tried to lure 3 girls into his car by saying he would give them new underwear. But thankfully, their father came out and he ran from the father, but they did end up catching him and he was brought into court, but the whole case was dismissed due to lack of evidence. And 3 weeks later, in the same area where Alexander would often work, a little girl would die. And actually, when he got out of jail after the case was dismissed, that was only 12 days prior to Lynn's murder. And no one even tried to connect this Alexander Kalachuk to Lynn Harper because the military were keeping this very quiet, keeping this to themselves. And Alexander was even said to sell his car shortly thereafter. 3 weeks after Lynn was found, Alexander in this file was said to be very anxious, full of guilt. He was sent to a psychiatric facility due to his behavior, but was then released again. The military knew Alexander was a bad man, and they often spoke about his sexual deviant behavior and his obsession with young girls. But they didn't fire him. They didn't dismiss him. They simply ignored it. Now, this area where he was actually staying at this time, police were telling young girls to stay inside and to watch out for a serial rapist in the area that they couldn't catch. The rest of Alexander's life was said to be in and out of psychiatric hospitals, and then he would eventually avoid capture of all sorts and drink himself to death in 1975. That is all that is known about Alexander, because this file was all that was ever told to anybody. Because the police didn't know, they were not informed, the hospitals didn't say anything. He was simply kept under the radar. It was kept quiet, and that was believed to be because the military did not want to tarnish their name by saying that one of their own could be such a horrific man. But they also didn't do anything to stop him from escalating or committing further crimes. Now, let's go back to those technically 6 murders that retired officer had all clumped together. Now, with the second murder that we talked about, who was Jacqueline, her case was actually since connected or believed to be connected to another murder that occurred a year later. Now, this is in kind of the same area. It was 15-year-old Soraya O'Connell, who was hitchhiking from camp and found 4 years after she vanished in a landfill, which is why I wasn't originally connected, because she was found 4 years later. But an author named Vanessa Brown has come out with a book called The Forest City Killer, and she speaks about Jacqueline, this Soraya, and then also Linda White, another victim that we talked about for the other serial killer, and she believes that those 3 murders are connected. However, she also speaks of 5 other victims that we have not even touched on that are unsolved today, and she groups those 8 together. The more I researched, the more victims I found, and it's horrifying how many unsolved murders were occurring around this same time. And then in 2004, a retired officer, Ontario officer, who had since passed away, was named Dennis Alsop. And his son found a box of Dennis's investigation that he was kind of doing on his own about these murders. He had been working on this case for what appeared to be years. He had many theories himself, especially in the murders of Jacqueline, Linda, and Soraya. But Dennis believed that this was a serial killer who had an erotic attraction to corpses and was lurking around southwestern Ontario and had already been convicted of murder. That he was willing to drive long distances for his kills, probably didn't live around the area, and would keep souvenirs, but would also keep the bodies for days, weeks, years before putting them out in their dumping grounds to be found. Now, due to these findings, the Oprah Winfrey Show actually did a segment on this, and they revealed that the police believed that a man named David, not living in the area, who had been convicted of a non-capital murder in the 1970s, was responsible for at least those 3 murders. It was said at that time he was still alive, but I could find nothing more on this or who in the world this David could be. Is David the same man as Larry Talbot? Now, the main theory of why these killings were happening so often around this time in this area is that the Highway 401 had just been built, connecting many of these different places and making it easier to slip in and out and to dump bodies on the side of the road in the woods. It's believed now that at least 7 serial killers use this area as a hunting ground, and 3 have been convicted, and this is Russell Johnson, the bedroom strangler who killed at least 3 women in London, Ontario. There was also Gerald Archer, who was known as the London chambermaid slayer, who killed 3 female hotel employees. There was also Christian Magee, who was the mad slasher who killed 3 girls as well. These 3 killers have been caught, and they're not believed to be connected to Lynn's murder or any unsolved murders that we talked about, but that just goes to show you how much blood was being shed around this time in this area when Lynn was killed. This was not just a shocking one-off murder that nobody could understand because it never happened before. This was something that was occurring all the time and never being solved. So the only option here for Lynn's murder was not a 14-year-old boy. And much investigation needed to occur. In fact, they had an entire base filled with possible suspects. And that's why many wonder if this was all a big cover-up at Station Clinton. Could Lynn's murderer have been a military man who was not Alexander, who was at Station Clinton, or worked there in some capacity, or had come down often for some reason? Was Station Clinton trying to keep their reputation clean, free of blood on their hands? It's said that the records of the year Lynn was murdered have since been destroyed or have just been lost, but there is no evidence of that year and what occurred at that station. But I mean, that's in the same way that the police station didn't preserve anything, and we have very, very, very little of the original police investigation, mainly because the police investigation was so small. But there were a few other unnamed suspects that I found in this case. It was very hard because there's not definite people to look at. It's people that there are theories about, but we can't fully look into them because we don't know all the details. And that included a convicted rapist that was found to have worked as an electrician at the Clinton base. He lived in Seaford, but he was at the base all the time fixing things, and he even once went to the Harper residence, Lynn's family, to fix the dryer not too long before she was killed. He allegedly moved all the way to the United States once Lynn's body was found, and there he ended up being charged and acquitted for different sexual assaults. Again, he was not ever looked into for Lynn's murder, but there was also a witness who claimed that when she was a little girl, her father would sexually assault her all the time. Her father was a minister, and one day she was hiding in his car when she saw him stop on a gravel road, open the trunk, and carry a girl into the woods. I could not find the name of this man either or any possible connections to any real person, and most statements of any other suspects weren't kept or weren't even fully looked into because the police were so adamant that this was Stephen, and they were not going to look anywhere else. And he was just a little boy who grew up way too fast inside a jail cell for a crime he didn't commit. Now, I do want to point out that it is very possible for children, for teenagers, to be evil, to be killers, to be serial killers, to be born with this horror inside of them. And I don't want this case to take that away because there's such a stigma around, oh, a child can't be a killer. They can, unfortunately, and even though that's terrifying to think of, which is why a lot of people don't want to think of it, it's something that we need to be prepared for, and it's something that we are seeing more and more often now, especially with mass shootings at schools, at different events. It's most of the time children, teenagers. But in this case, there was no evidence of that, and if Stephen is guilty, they at least needed to investigate into why he was guilty. Now, some even wondered if this was another child in the area, a group of children, or even an adult who was in that area. I tend to think that Butch, who is one of Stephen's friends, kind of placed himself into the investigation before it was even an investigation, before Lynn's body was even found, before her disappearance was even announced. He kind of was telling everybody what Stephen and Lynn were doing, and it made many wonder if maybe he was the one involved instead. The day after Lynn was found, Stephen was arrested, and they found someone to blame and didn't look back. But today, Stephen is actually taking back his name, and Stephen's kids, they're grown now, and they said they have never suspected anything dark about their father. In fact, when he told them what had happened to him, they felt even closer through what he had been through, and his son even says that he's a hero, someone they look up to. And Stephen and his wife have actually started looking into Lynn's murder themselves and trying to solve it, because a real investigation was never done. Nobody's really doing it today. There's so much that is just kind of crowding getting Lynn's murder solved. I mean, I think that retired officer Barry Roll, I think he's doing a great job in trying to connect these to a possible serial killer and all of that. But at the end of the day, all of the information, all of the different theoretical suspects that nobody actually wants to name or to actually connect is just making this harder rather than just being open about what is being found. I get that a lot of times in an open investigation, you have to keep information from the public to make sure that the case can be solved. But after so many years, I think it's best just to be very open with the public and what is known so that we can try to help in any way we can. And I think that's the only way this case is going to be solved. And Stephen has said that, justice was not done for his family or for Lynn's. And I actually could not find a lot of information about Lynn's family and exactly how they felt throughout the years, if they changed their minds about still believing that Stephen was guilty, if they ever believe or will believe that he is innocent. I could not find a lot about what they have spoken out about. I don't think they speak out often. Bob Lawson, the man whose property that Lynn's body was found on, has said to have struggled with PTSD since then. He was the one who actually had to go down and look at the body, and he struggles to sleep, and he said that back then there were no treatments for things like PTSD. In fact, PTSD was only believed to be able to occur in soldiers of war. Bob said he was friends with a lot of the school kids and he just loved having them around. They were always helpful, but after this, they stopped coming to the farm altogether. Now, of course, with Lynn's body being found on his property, it does make you wonder. However, I've seen no theories on Bob Lawson and his possible involvement. If there was any evidence of that, he seems to be an honest man from not wanting to lie for Jocelyn's story. But it's just interesting to me that no one has brought it up, if that makes sense. Now, Lynn's case has since gone cold, and although he was acquitted, many still believe that Stephen Truscott was guilty of murder. Was it another child? A group of them? An unknown killer who picked Lynn up that day? A serial killer in the area? Sergeant Alexander, who is known for these type of crimes, or at least the sexual assault? I tend to lean towards Alexander, mainly due to the paranoia and anxiety he was showing after Lynn's murder, but his crimes were not normally said to progress to murder, or at least nobody knew of those murders. But it makes you wonder, is that why he was so paranoid and anxious? Because he wasn't meaning to murder Lynn. Maybe he went to sexually assault her, she fought back, and he killed her because of that. Maybe it's the same motive that they blamed Stephen for, but they had the wrong man. Maybe that was why there was almost a sign of remorse in the folded clothes and making sure everything was neat and tidy around her. Maybe he didn't want to kill her and felt bad after it occurred. Because that's what I really don't understand. Stephen really wouldn't have had the time to fold the clothes, to kill her, to drag her to the bush, to drive back towards the military base in that short amount of time. It just seems cutting it close, especially for him appearing to be calm and not completely shaken after doing all of that, taking his time folding clothes, putting her necklace on a tree. You know what I mean? It just seems very odd. However, with all of these victims, all of these unsolved murders, it's hard to ignore the possibility of serial killers. And if it's not that, then imagine how many killers had to have killed somebody during this time. So let me know what you think about this very, very odd case, and make sure to check back in on this channel because there's so much content I'm going to be posting in October. And yeah, if you want to download the Fetch app, you can just use the code Brooke Makenna for 5,000 points when you scan your first receipt. It's a great deal. Click the link down below for free, and also if you want merch, that link will be down below as well. So don't forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.